I want to welcome Stephen Haven to the Meacham workshop. Hello, Steve. How you doing?
I'm doing great.
All
Thanks,
right.
Richard, for having me.
Yeah. Well, we've been starting these interviews by having you read a poem. So,
Great. I'll read a poem from my new book, just out a few days ago, The Last Sacred Place in North America. The poem I'll read is Beijing Student Riot, May 12th, 1999. Cold in a Beijing spring, an old man has gone 4 days without his insulin. Even laser-guided missiles miss the mark. So says CNN, mistag the living for the dead. In an instant, the Belgrade Chinese embassy morphed to bric-a-brac in air, though dust motes still float. Now, this morning, out on Anja Laolu, the American ambassador cannot go home. He barricades himself behind 4 tense Marines. Lucky for them, they are monoglots and cannot, even with pinyin placards, speak their names. On the screen, I try and cannot find students from Beijing Shufendajue. Somewhere they throw through an old man's window stones thousands of years old. I am here this morning, 1 year gone in my rural Ohio home. I'm glad they love for a short while my daughter, my son. And me, how often from that same American embassy I met their requests for the likes of Casablanca, mighty Aphrodite, cueing my students into the joke when from deep space some Greek chorus summoned Zeus and America boomed to the laugh of a pre-recorded voice. There is no one here to take your call right now. You know what to do. Please leave your prayer after the beep. I will get back to you. Politics is never personal, so says Mario Puzo. My students didn't see the romantic in Bogart's Blaine. Even then, in 1942, the propaganda of an American who thinks for everyone, never cracks a grin, smokes a lucky strike, drinks whiskey, gin, and bends all Europe till the world is right. They asked for sex and violence to stir their still nights. I gave them Brando, Bacino, talked it over a while in a late-night Jiaozi shop. One by one, with Quaitza, we lifted to our mouths fried kernels of salt. They never slugged a beer, due deference to their foreign Laoshi. All the way to Shisha Pangma, the West thrusts its drilled insolence. This morning I ask only for the counsel of Robert Duvall. It's only business, after all. Anonymous, strictly protocol, quiet in the way that it explodes, always from a distance, on someone, somewhere known.
oh, thanks very much. Maybe talk a little bit about the genesis of that poem.
Sure, I spent a couple years, Fulbright years teaching in Beijing, and I was working, as you know, from collaborative translations of contemporary Chinese poetry, and was beginning to write about my experiences in China, as I did in my earlier book as well. The middle section of this collection has a lot of material from China. So I was trying to think of potential poems that would fill this book out, and remembered coming back from that year in Beijing and seeing the students riot and wondering what would it have been like if I was still on campus, and you know, all that anti-American feeling was going around at that time.
And I remember that when that embassy was bombed, as I was working with the Sarajevo Peace Committee for the war in Bosnia and Kosovo and all that. And when it had spilled over into Kosovo, things were getting real dicey. And it was really interesting because in many ways, the only way to stop a lot of the ethnic cleansing was by force of arms. But on the other hand, we were Sarajevo Peace Committee, which, it was really for all of Yugoslavia. And so there was a lot of conflicting feelings there, and I see a little bit of that in there too.
Yeah, it was a very complicated political situation. Yeah. I tried to get at that in the poem. There were victims on all sides. There was a young couple in that embassy that was honeymooning, I believe with a child. They were killed. I think we pretty well know that the Chinese were gathering intelligence from the embassy. But we also know that it was not a mistake, that Clinton knew very well what he was doing. And the claim initially was that they missed, that they sent a laser.
Smart bombs don't miss.
No, laser-guided missiles don't tend to miss, so, yeah.
Wow. How do you usually begin a poem, in general?
I tend to think a lot about the line, as a kind of aesthetic measure, and so I care about writing good lines and try to let the sense of the poem follow the line rather than the other way around. So I'm not sure that I could define that exactly, but I know that I was working with a longer line. Trying to, really fill a poem out by pushing the movement across the page.
Yeah. And I know you write a lot of other stuff besides poetry too. How do you go back and forth? Does one influence another?
Yeah, I wrote, as you know, a memoir earlier, and that memoir, The River Lock, One Boy's Life Along the Mohawk, draws from a lot of the same material as my first book of poems. Sometimes I describe in the memoir the exact same scene that I wrote about, in a poem earlier. But there's a lot of adolescent violence in that memoir, and I found in a way that the book of poems softened that violence. The music of the poetry would soften some of those moments of conflict in my adolescence. And so I wanted to get beyond the Reader's Digest version. It felt like the poems were, in a sense, the Reader's Digest version because they softened some of the harsher moments. So decided to go back and revisit those and write them in greater detail in prose.
Yeah, and I wonder, if you took some of the material from those middle poems and translated them back into prose, if more of a one-sided anger might come out.
Possibly, especially if I were on campus, because as you know, the students cornered the American ambassador in the embassy, and the man was diabetic, and they were preventing him.
Remember that. Oh.
They were preventing him from getting his medication, and so that man, I'm sure he's implicated in any political decision the United States might make, and yet he's an old man, and he needs his medicine, and I probably was being a bit dramatic and thinking that my students might have been down there rioting, and actually I have a lot of close personal friends who I'm sure would never turn on me personally in that way, and yet there was a lot of nationalism in China. There still is. And a good bit of anti-American feeling, even as the Chinese people tend also to love America. They have a kind of conflicted feeling toward the States.
How has translation influenced your writing?
Well, I always work collaboratively. I have only survival Chinese. I can say a lot of things. I don't understand much. But I have a lot of good bilingual friends who are poets or scholars. And so we tend to work together line by line, sit down with beer and spend an evening and very carefully argue with each other over lines. I think maybe the Chinese poets I've translated write a little bit more wildly. Especially 10 or 20 years ago when the government actually was paying attention to contemporary Chinese poets. And so they would tend to mask, what they were saying literally, maybe in the way that Eastern European poets did as well under communist rule. Today, I think the Chinese government's not really paying that much attention to the poets because there's been a media explosion in China. There are rock stars there now. They don't care as much about poetry, so that maybe they have a greater degree of freedom. But I tried to write with maybe a bit more wildness. Emerson claims at one point that a poet can only write adequately if he writes somewhat wildly. And so I try to embrace that spirit in this book and, yeah, not worry about the literal meaning quite so much in some poems.
And you teach your students that same kind of, how do you teach wildness? I know you teach at Ashland in the MFA program, the low residency program.
Well, I like to talk about getting beyond the tyranny of the rational mind, you know, and one way to do that is through the music of the poem, or through the sense of the line as, you know, an aesthetic measure. And if you let that sense of aesthetics or that sense of music, or it could be a visual sensibility, you know, drive the poem rather than the preconceived notion, and let the poem go maybe in a direction you never imagined it would go.
Exactly, yeah. Well, terrific. Well, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay.